Good evening. It's Colby here presenting the Game Week 9 analysis and report. I've got a fantastic report lined up for you all today. Basically, I'm planning on focusing on breaking down and comparing a number of different attributes of the team's scores over the first 9 game weeks, and also delving into the role of Russian influence on Fantrax scoring and league positioning this year. But I'll get more to that a little bit later on. My plan is really to analyse and make fun of each of the teams in the league individually, as well as go through some of the WhatsApp messages thread to look back on some of the more creative predictions that have been made in there, and to see how they're faring after a quarter of the season has already flown by. But it's all in good fun. I hope no one takes anything that I say too seriously. So let's jump straight into it. Here we have it. This is the current standings in the league. This hasn't been updated to include the substitutes from the previous game week. That appears to be something that we're just not doing anymore, I guess. So I think there will be a little shift in the positions on the leaderboard once we do account for the substitutes. I think Pugslug will be pushing back up into second position once all of the subs are accounted for. But looking at the league, I guess the thing that really strikes me is that after a quarter of the season has gone by, there really is such an even spread of points between all of us sitting there. It's a pretty tight league. I think it really emphasises just how competitive it is this season and how difficult it will be to lock down one of those positions in the playoffs. If you look at the ladder spread there's only 2 wins that are separating 11th place from 4th place. And so really everyone is in contention to make those playoff spots. When I say everyone, I couldn't actually fit this guy onto the first slide due to the graphic distortion of the ladder. Nick Enright sitting there in 12th position. I just put him here on this second slide. He's got 2 wins, 7 losses so far. And let's just not forget that 50% of his total wins for the season have come about because some Muppet forgot to put his subs in 2 hours before the deadline. So really, Nick Enright, as we've seen from the luck predictor that Dan has put on in his report, he really is overperforming that current position on the ladder. And just a quick reminder that he did make this bet with me early in the season, which is looking good for everyone for the end of the season dinner. Okay, good. Thanks. Moving on. So I thought the numbers that I wanted to run over in the report and to graph out so that we can sort of visualize them all are really from these 4 categories. The highest, I want to look at the highest and the lowest scores that each of our teams have put out over the first 9 game weeks. And I also want to look at the average scores and standard deviation of points for each of the teams to see how closely these values align with the overall standings on the ladder so far. So this is the first graph. This graph shows us the maximum scores that our teams have put out over the first 9 game weeks. It's graded from the lowest on the left to the highest on the right. And clearly the glaring outlier here is Brett's game week 6 score of almost 110, where pretty much every single one of his players seemed to score or keep a clean sheet in that game week. Of course, he was playing Dan for this match, which automatically, statistically, significantly increases the amount of luck that anyone experiences, as Dan has shown from his luck analysis algorithm charts that he posted in his report. What is interesting is that the high scores in this graph don't really correlate with league position, and you can see that 4 of the top 6 players with the max scores in this graph are outside of the top 5 overall standings this so far. What it does show is that when you're playing teams like Brett and Harry, that you need to be prepared to get beaten if their ceiling players hit the mark and they score, because their teams just have huge ceilings when they come up against you. This is the next graph. It shows the lowest scores of the campaign so far. And as you'll see, our striving leader from the max score graph is also leading by a pretty significant margin. The lowest score of the campaign with 28.5 points in game week 3. You can see from the left of the graph that the teams with the lowest scores are corresponding pretty accurately to the teams in the bottom of the ladder. More so, I guess, than the previous graph with the maximum points were corresponding to teams at the top of the ladder. The outlier in that fact here, I guess, is Panda, who has quite an amazing lowest score of 48.5. But he's still keeping Nick company at the bottom of the ladder. So what's going on here? Well, if you look a little bit closer at the game weeks that he has lost, he's had some really narrow losses. He's had 3 matches where he's lost by between 3 and 7 points, which is really unlucky. And he's also lost 2 games against Brett and Harry, who are the 2 players, remember, that sit at the top of the max points table and have that, I guess, more unpredictable and high-scoring teams. And in those matches, both of those players, they hit their ceilings pretty well, and they scored around 70 points against him. So probably pretty unlucky, and I think he'll be climbing the ranks in the next few weeks if he can keep up those tight minimum scores. This graph shows the average scores for each of the teams, with the lowest averages on the left, the highest on the right. It's interesting to look at this graph after seeing the previous 2, because if you were looking purely at this graph, or at the fantasy points that each team is scoring per game, you'd expect, for example, teams like Brett's to be, we would expect that his position of sitting 10th on the ladder at the moment would be way underperforming where he should be, because his average is so high. And also that teams like Pugslug should be sitting a bit lower than second. But as we saw, the spread of extreme high scores one week and extreme low scores in another week can really make teams prone to losing against teams with low average points, and therefore having low overall standings on the ladder. This is really the graph that I like the most. This is a graph of the standard deviation of points that have been scored in the game week so far. In other words, it's a measure of the spread of points above or below the average number of points that team has been scoring. So basically, the higher your standard deviation is, as shown on the left of this graph, the more unpredictable game week score you will have each week. It may be high, it may be low, but it's not sitting around the average each time. So as we expect with the highs and lows that have been highlighted in the previous graphs, Brett and Harry's teams both sit there on the left of the graph with the highest standard deviation. Therefore, they're the most unpredictable. At the other end of the spectrum, Crispy's team has an extremely narrow range of points that he's been scoring each week. So he's been averaging around 60, and he's been going up and down about 6 points around that, but hitting that mark pretty much consistently. And I think that this is likely reflected by how nailed the players that you have in your starting 11 are, and how consistently they're returning good points. I mean, someone like Salah, who is nailed as they come, really, and he pumps out huge stats every week, returns regularly. That's why he's the number 1 draft pick, is sitting in Crispy's team. So we'd expect that his team would have a pretty low standard deviation on their game week scores. The goal of, I guess, winning the head-to-head matchups consistently, it really relies on having a high average points per week score and a low standard deviation so that you're consistently scoring, on average, more points than the person that you're versing. I guess in contrast to this, the teams on the left side with a high standard deviation will have the ability to pretty much beat any team that they come up against, because really, which relies on their players that have high ceilings. If they come off altogether, there's no team that they won't beat. But consistently winning games may be more difficult for these teams, because in the game weeks where those players miss and they don't score points, the total points tally will be pretty low. But I wanted to look a little bit deeper at the cause of why there's such a variation in the standard deviation. And as I sort of alluded to at the start of the report, I think it's because of the influence of Russians. So let me explain to you what I mean by Russians. Okay, so Russians are these guys, they're really fun, they're really exciting, but they like to play stupid fucking games like Russian roulette. And they might start, so these players, they might start most of the games, everything will be going along really well, but every now and then, when they squeeze the trigger, a bullet fires out of the gun, and these motherfuckers scores 1 point for your team, they ruin your game week. Essentially, they're players that are not nailed to the starting 11, they might get less minutes than other players, but they have a really high ceiling of points when they do return, so they're exciting players to own, but you don't probably want to own too many of them. The way that I decided who I would include into the Russian Mafia was all players who had had 3 or more games with less than 70 minutes on the pitch, who either had scored 1 goal or had 2 assists. So they're players that are returning pretty good returns when they are playing. They're not reliable, but they can win your game weeks when they come off. If you have too many of them and they all miss at the same time, you'll end up losing the game week to someone who has a pretty low average game week score. Let me give you an example. All right, so this guy is the fucking Vladimir Putin of the Russians. Okay, David Silva. He even looks like the guy when he's got his shirt off and he's feeding a fucking horse in the countryside somewhere. He's an amazing player. Like, don't get me wrong. Everyone loves watching this guy play. He, scores goals. He gets assists for fun. He's a really great player to watch. But if you look at his scores, he's had 4 game weeks where he's scored more than 10 points, goals or double assists. Really useful when they come off. But he's also had these game weeks where he comes on for 4 minutes, he comes on for 12 minutes, and he scores 1 point for your team. It makes you want to quit the fucking game. So this is a good example of a Russian, okay? Now, the way that each person has been managing their Russians is also an important factor, okay? Some of us have been playing them week in, week out, and others have been selectively benching the Russians, trying to hit the high scores when they come off and then avoiding the low scores when they think they might not get a start. But it's difficult to manage. So let's have a look at how many Russians are hidden in each of our teams, and also look at whether the number of Russians that you have is affecting your overall standing on the ladder. I've also included a couple of screenshots from the WhatsApp thread to go through with the analysis for each of the teams to try and have some fun with it. So first up is Monko. He's got 2 sneaky little Russians sitting in there, in Bernard and Danny Ings. Now both of these are actually players that he's been trying to offload in the last few days. Maybe he's got some sort of Trump insider Russian information bullshit going on, and he knows what's happening with these Russians. But if you are light on Russians, like if you see your team, you haven't got many Russians there, these may be the guys that you want to pick up to add some unpredictability and some sort of ceilings to your team's max score. But this is a photo just to remind us that Monko's judgment, it's been pretty poor in the past. This is evidenced by this chat that he had about Temi never scoring a brace again the rest of the Premier League season, and then right before he went on and did it the following game week. So good times there. What about Panda? Well, he's got 3 Russians sitting there: Willian, Siggy, and Deli Ali. Not a huge number, but certainly more than average. He also made this sneaky bet earlier in the season that Josh King wouldn't be outscored by 2 of Danish's midfielders, and this is for $50. And just looking at the predictions after a quarter of the season's gone by, it's looking pretty good for the most booted man in the thread this season, with both McNeil and Buendia looking pretty good on Josh King. Interesting use of the word world beaters by Danish and his lack of concern about who his opposition is each week, despite the fact that he spent several hours devising a luck calculating algorithm that makes him feel a lot better about his underperforming world beaters. Next up in the analysis is the reigning champion of the league, Nick Enright. This guy has 5 Russians sitting in his squad, making him one of the Russian mafia leaders within the league. There's 2 of them. Fortunately for him, though, Eriksson, as we know, he's only a recently acquired Russian, just transferred him in this game week, and he is. And if the transfer news really is anything to go by, he'll be down to just 4 Russians again in a few months' time, with PSG looking to hijack Real Madrid's transfer of Christian Eriksen. Enjoy that one, mate. Harry, just 2 Russians in his team, in El Ghazi and Lamela. He's still managing to throw out some huge max scores with some pretty high standard deviation. So despite not having a huge number of Russians, still getting a good max score, good standard deviation. This is just a throwback to when Nick was talking about the heat map analysis of Virgil van Dijk, which just didn't seem to make any fucking sense to Harry. That's still unresolved, I guess. Now, despite everything that Dan has said about Doherty in the chat this season, he does still meet, unfortunately, Dan, he does still meet Russian criteria. He sits alongside Neil as the 2 Russians in his squad. It was tough to choose which chat highlight to put in here from Dan, but one relating to Doherty surely had to take the prize. So here it looks like Doherty He really hasn't been sick, and he hasn't needed surgery, and he's definitely not playing 100% of game times, which you can see from his minutes, which have been highlighted here, a number of 45, 22, 34, 45, 76. So looking pretty correct there in your analysis, Kerr. Well done. Next up is Bretto, who has definitely experienced, as we have seen, the highs and lows of game week scores. He only has he has four Russians sitting there who pretty much make up his entire regular playing midfield. So Bernardo Silva, Mahrez, and Ndombele, they're not just Russians, but they're also high draft picked Russians. Which makes them have a pretty significant impact on his team going forward. Hopefully, Lacazette, who makes up the fourth Russian in this team, will get his way back into the starting 11, which I'm sure he will, and give Bretto some more regular returns into his squad and a bit more consistency. I wanted to highlight just the 2 game weeks that really reflect the high degree of Russian influence in Bretto's team, and emphasize that he lost MJ, who in this game week had a lower point score than every single team in the league's average game week score so far. So this is the danger in fraternizing with the Russians. Holden is another Russian mafia member, and he has 5 players meeting criteria in his team. He's got Hurahan, he's got Pepe, he's got Pulisic and Jesus and Yarmolenko. Now, it is interesting. The interesting thing is that Holden's standard deviation is actually one of the lowest in the leagues, and I think that this is related to how he's managing his Russians. I mean, if you look at Jesus, for example, good example of a Russian, after giving him the nod to start the first 2 game weeks, he came and he played 10 points. It appeared that Holden has sort of recognised some of the pitfalls of starting these Russians regularly, and he actually hasn't started Jesus since those first 2 game weeks. And so it means that he's got some pretty impressive scores, unfortunately, that sit onto the bench. You can see there he scored 23.5 points, more than twice as many points on the bench than he has being counted when he's on the field. So it's a big source of frustration, and these Russians are pretty hard to manage, I think. Kurd has just the 2 Russians in his squad, and Barnes and Connolly. Connolly, of course, a newly acquired player for his squad, and Barnes has a number of appearances off the bench on his team, so he has been benching his Russians well. It's reflecting his good Russian management. I couldn't really find anything much to poke fun at in the thread from Kerr other than his disbelief in McTominay, which I thought I would just emphasise how good this kid is doing this season. He's 27th overall for points scored by players like Felipe Anderson, Allaire, Luka Dean, and even Vladimir Putin is ranked below this guy. My squad, I've got 2 Russians sitting there in Fraser and Moira. Fraser, he's been a bit frustrating. He's had some issues with injury. He's also had this sort of weird transfer link with Arsenal, which may be playing a factor in his rotation. Moira is basically just a piece of shit that hurts me to the core to own. This guy can score a hat-trick in the fucking Champions League and help his squad reach the final, but Poch won't trust him to start in the lineup against fucking Brighton. Like, fuck this guy. I hate this guy. If you want to buy this guy off me, make me some deals. I'll open the bidding at like $15. Seriously, make me offers for this guy. MJ, he's got 3 Russians, Aguero being a newly acquired player for his squad. Pep's brutal, unpredictable rotation makes a lot of the valuable City assets showing a lot of Russian influence recently. Pep did say in a recent presser that Aguero is better used in those sort of tight, compact areas like exists when teams come to the Etihad. So it may be a matter of playing this Russian for a lot of the home games and considering benching him for some of the away games where you think he might be sitting on the bench after he's played a full 90 minutes in the Champions League. Yeah, it's tough to manage. You wouldn't really ever put Aguero on your bench, but it's sort of highlighting the fact that these Russians can really fuck you if they don't come off and they're playing for a couple of minutes at a time. Here's a reminder that he also does own Ozil, who unfortunately doesn't reach Russian status because he's only played 1 fucking game all season. Crispy's team, pretty short on Russians, just the 2 in Anderson and Harry Wilson. Harry Wilson hasn't made that many appearances on the starting 11 for him. His standard deviation, again, is the lowest in the league, meaning that while Crispy's team is averaging on around 60 points per game, as he sort of pointed out in this photo chat, he is still losing to teams who have Russians that are coming off and firing against him. So maybe for his team, it would be worth considering bringing a few Russians into the starting 11 to bump up that max score and increase his standard deviation. Last but surely not least, the Pug Slug. These guys have Vladimir Putin himself as their only Russian soldier. And we've seen how devastating he can be, both to opponents and to yourself if you own him. The only game weeks that the Pug Slug has lost this season are, of course, coming in those weeks where Putin has failed to pull the trigger and he's sort of blown his brains out. Definitely he's helping the Pug Slug to get over the line against some teams who are averaging higher than he is, which sort of highlights the way that Russians can be used well to win games that maybe you potentially shouldn't be winning. Good work there, Pug Slug. So here's a graph. It just shows all the number of Russians that we all have and compares them so you can visualize it. As you can see, there appears to be a little bit of a threshold at about 3 to 4 Russian mark where having more than that probably is causing some detriment to the team. Having less is probably a good thing. You can see that the top 5 Russian owners actually do occupy the bottom 5 spots in the league, which may just be related to the unpredictability that comes with having them. Unpredictability, I guess, but also excitement for the game weeks. You know, there's probably a sweet spot that involves owning maybe not 4 or 5, maybe 2 or 3 of these players to bump your team up. So what should we do with all this information? What do we do with these fucking Russians? Well, I think if your team has a high average point return each week, but a low standard deviation, I think you may benefit from introducing more risk into your team so that you can continue to have a decent average return, but also increasing your max score so you're not losing to other players who have all these Russians in their team that might just spike a score against you. If you're a member of the Russian Mafia, you own 5 of these players, you might look to trade one of them out to maybe a more nailed player who has regular returns for you. It may also influence which players you start and which ones you bench, depending on your opponent each week. I mean, if you may want to play more Russians when you're versing a team in the game week that has a higher average point score than you do, so that if they do hit their ceiling, you might jag a win against the player that you may not may not have been able to beat. Likewise, if you're playing a team with a really low average score, you might want to mitigate some of your own risk by reducing the number of Russians that you field. Ultimately, look, I'm sure everyone's going to field their best 11. They're going to roll the dice on their Russians and try to spike big scores. I'm sure that's the way it will be. It's just something to think about. Alright guys, that's it. Thanks for listening. That's a wrap on the Game Week 9 report. I hope it wasn't too boring or stupid for you, and I hope that this Russian influence will be taken into consideration going forward. I'm out.